The Montana Territory breathes differently in winter than any other season. It inhales with the bone-deep cold of November storms and exhales with the crystalline silence that follows fresh snowfall. In the vast expanse of the Bitterroot Valley, where pine forests stretch like dark green seas toward snow-capped peaks and the horizon disappears into walls of advancing storm clouds, survival depends on reading the smallest signs that nature provides. Here, beneath the endless dome of grey, winter sky, stories unfold that test the very limits of human compassion and the bonds that can form between strangers from different worlds. Some tales begin with violence, others with silence. This one began with a blizzard that would change 2 lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Catherine Mitchell had lived 41 years before she learned what it meant to be truly alone. Not the comfortable solitude of choosing one's own company, but the absolute isolation that comes when winter storms cut you off from civilization for months at a time, and the only sounds you hear are your own footsteps echoing through an empty cabin. The cabin itself stood like a defiant monument to human stubbornness in the face of nature's indifference. Built by her late husband Thomas 3 years earlier, it occupied a small clearing beside Willow Creek, where the water ran fast enough to avoid freezing even in the harshest weather. Thomas had chosen the location carefully, understanding that water meant life in country, where a single miscalculation could prove fatal. The structure was solid frontier craftsmanship, built from lodgepole pine logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a stone fireplace that could burn through the longest winter nights. Thomas had planned every detail with the methodical precision of a man who understood that winter forgives no shortcuts or oversights. Double walls for insulation, a root cellar dug deep enough to store vegetables through the coldest months, and windows positioned to catch every available hour of precious winter sunlight. Sarah had protested the location. When Thomas first showed it to her, it was too isolated, too far from the growing settlement of Stevensville, too vulnerable to the kind of severe weather that could trap a family for weeks without possibility of rescue. But Thomas had been convinced that isolation was exactly what they needed. Sarah, he had said in that patient voice he used when explaining his reasoning, the territory's changing faster than most folks realize. More settlers coming every year, more miners, more soldiers. Pretty soon there won't be any quiet places left for people who just want to live peacefully and raise their children right. Thomas had been a school teacher back in Ohio before the war changed everything. He'd enlisted with the 7th Ohio Infantry, served through campaigns that left him with a permanent limp and a deep distrust of crowded places. When the war ended, he'd wanted nothing more than to find a place where he could teach again, farm a little, and forget the things he'd seen in Georgia and Tennessee. Sarah had been the daughter of the local doctor in their Ohio town, a woman whose education was considered unusual for her time. She could read Latin, spoke passable French, and had assisted her father with enough medical procedures to understand anatomy and basic surgery better than many frontier doctors. Her marriage to Thomas had been a partnership of minds as much as hearts, 2 people who shared books, discussed philosophy, and planned a future that would make use of both their skills. The move to Montana Territory had been their attempt to start fresh in a place where Thomas's war injuries wouldn't mark him as different, and Sarah's unconventional education might actually be valued rather than viewed with suspicion. They had planned to establish a school, serve the scattered ranching families who were beginning to settle the valley, and perhaps start a family of their own. For 2 years, the plan had worked beautifully. Thomas taught the children of settlers, cowboys, and even some of the mixed-blood families who lived between the white and native worlds. Sarah had served as the valley's unofficial doctor, treating everything from broken bones to difficult births. Their cabin had become a gathering place where neighbors could find not just medical care and education, but books, music, and the kind of civilized conversation that was rare in frontier communities. Then came the fever epidemic of 1878. It swept through the valley like wildfire, claiming victims seemingly at random. Sarah worked tirelessly, moving from cabin to cabin, trying to treat symptoms she barely understood with remedies that seemed to help some patients while failing completely with others. Thomas had insisted on accompanying her, carrying medical supplies and helping to care for the sickest patients. He'd contracted the fever during their visits to the Brennan family, where 3 children were dying despite everything Sarah could do to save them. Thomas had spent 2 nights sitting with the youngest boy, a 6-year-old who reminded him of students he'd taught back in Ohio. When the child died in his arms, something broke inside Thomas that never quite healed. The fever took him within a week. Sarah watched helplessly as the man who had survived 3 years of Civil War combat was defeated by an enemy too small to see. His last words were an apology for leaving her alone in a place where she would have to face winter without the partner, who had made their isolation bearable. That had been 3 months ago. Sarah had buried Thomas in the small cemetery behind their cabin, marking his grave with a wooden cross carved from the same lodgepole pine he had used to build their home. She had considered returning to Ohio, selling the cabin and land, and resuming the conventional life she had left behind. But something held her to this place that she and Thomas had chosen together. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the recognition that she had become someone different during her years in the territory. The skills she had developed as an unofficial frontier doctor, the independence she had learned from managing a homestead, the deep satisfaction of helping neighbors who had no other source of medical care, these were not things she could easily abandon. The first major test of her resolve to stay had come with the October blizzard. 3 days of howling wind and driving snow had isolated her completely, cutting her off from even the nearest neighbors. She had spent those days alone with her books, her memories, and the constant work of keeping the fire burning and the cabin warm. When the storm finally passed, she had emerged to find her world transformed. Snow drifts reached nearly to the cabin's eaves, and the familiar landmarks of her daily life were buried under a white blanket that would not fully melt until
spring.
The isolation that had once seemed manageable with Thomas beside her now felt absolute and potentially deadly. But Sarah Catherine Mitchell had not survived 41 years, including 3 in the Montana Territory, by surrendering to circumstances she couldn't control. She had supplies enough for the winter, skills enough to treat her own minor injuries and illnesses, and books enough to keep her mind occupied during the long evenings. What she didn't have was any way to call for help if something went seriously wrong. The November morning that would change everything began like all the others since Thomas's death. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of wind rattling the cabin's shutters and the urgent crackling of a fire that needed fresh wood. She had developed routines that gave structure to days that might otherwise have stretched endlessly without purpose. First, she checked the fire and added logs from the carefully stacked pile that Thomas had cut before his illness. Then she put coffee on to boil and prepared a simple breakfast of cornbread and preserved fruit from their root cellar. While she ate, she read from one of Thomas's philosophy books, continuing discussions they had started together, even though she now had to supply both sides of the conversation. After breakfast came the daily tasks that kept their homestead functioning. Checking on the small herd of cattle that wintered in the shelter Thomas had built near the creek, splitting wood to maintain their fuel supply, and maintaining the equipment and tools that might mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. If something broke during the isolation of deep winter, the work was harder without Thomas's help, but Sarah had always been stronger than her refined appearance suggested. 3 years of frontier life had built muscle and endurance that her Ohio neighbors would never have expected from the doctor's educated daughter. She could split wood efficiently, manage livestock competently, and repair most of the things that might break around a frontier homestead. What she couldn't repair was the growing sense that her isolation was becoming something more dangerous than mere loneliness. The November weather had been increasingly severe, with storms that seemed to arrive without warning and last longer than the valley's old-timers remembered from previous years. Twice she had been forced to rope herself to the cabin when checking on the livestock, using the line as a guide back through snow so thick she couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. The morning of November 15th brought weather that looked particularly threatening. The western sky was the color of old pewter, with clouds that seemed to be building towards something more serious than the usual daily snow flurries. The wind had a different quality too, not the steady push of normal winter weather, but the irregular gusting that suggested a major storm system was approaching. Sarah had learned to read these signs during her years in the territory. She spent the morning preparing for what might be several days of being housebound, bringing in extra wood, checking her water supply, and making sure the livestock had access to the shelter and feed they would need if the storm proved as severe. As the sky suggested, it was while she was securing the shutters on the cabin's north-facing windows that she first heard the sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Faint and almost lost in the wind, it might have been the call of an animal or the creaking of tree branches under the weight of accumulated snow. But something about the quality of the sound made her stop her work and listen more carefully. There, it was again, not an animal, not a tree, but something that sounded almost like a human voice. Sarah stood perfectly still, straining to hear over the wind that was beginning to pick up strength as the storm approached. The sound came a third time, and now she was certain. Someone was calling for help, and they were close enough to her cabin that she might be able to reach them. The decision to investigate went against every rule of winter survival that Thomas had taught her. In weather like this, leaving the safety of the cabin to search for someone who might be anywhere in the surrounding forest was exactly the kind of mistake that turned single tragedies into multiple deaths. But Sarah had spent 3 years serving as the medical resource for families scattered across the valley. The instinct to respond when someone needed help was stronger than her concern for personal safety. She dressed quickly in her heaviest winter clothes, including the buffalo coat that Thomas had traded for during their first winter. She tied a rope around her waist and secured the other end to the cabin's front porch, creating a lifeline that would guide her back even if the weather worsened beyond her ability to navigate by sight. Following the sound through increasingly heavy snowfall, Sarah made her way toward the creek where the calls seemed to be originating. The voice was definitely human now, and definitely in distress. It sounded young, possibly a child, which made her decision to investigate seem both more urgent and more dangerous. What she found beside the half-frozen creek changed everything she thought she knew about survival, compassion, and the complex relationship between the different peoples who shared the Montana territory. Huddled against the base of a large cottonwood tree, barely conscious and obviously injured, was a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. His clothing identified him immediately as Apache, traditional buckskin decorated with beadwork that was now stained with blood from wounds Sarah couldn't yet assess. More critically, his lips were blue with cold, and his breathing was shallow and irregular in a way that spoke of serious hypothermia. The boy's presence beside her creek raised questions that Sarah couldn't begin to answer. Apache bands were not common in this part of Montana territory, and a child traveling alone through winter weather suggested circumstances that were either desperate or tragic. But questions could wait until after she had dealt with the immediate medical emergency. Sarah had treated enough cases of severe exposure to know that the next few minutes would determine whether this boy lived or died. She untied the rope from her waist and used it to create a makeshift stretcher, wrapping the unconscious child in her buffalo coat before beginning the difficult task of getting him back to the cabin through snow that was now falling so heavily she could barely see the smoke from her own chimney. The journey back to the cabin became a race against time and weather that tested every bit of strength and determination Sarah possessed. The boy was small, but unconscious weight is always heavier than it appears, and the deepening snow made every step treacherous. Twice she fell, nearly losing her grip on the improvised stretcher, and had to rest while snow accumulated on both of them. By the time she reached the cabin, Sarah was exhausted, and the boy's condition had visibly worsened. His breathing was even more shallow, and she couldn't detect a pulse at his wrist. Working with the desperate efficiency that 3 years of frontier medicine had taught her, she carried him inside and began the delicate process of treating severe hypothermia without shocking his system into cardiac arrest. The treatment required careful warming, starting with the core and working outward. Sarah stripped away the boy's wet clothing and wrapped him in warm blankets near the fire, but not close enough to cause rapid temperature changes that could be fatal. She prepared warm broth and began the slow process of getting liquid into a patient who was barely conscious. As she worked, Sarah noticed details that added to the mystery of how this child had come to be alone and injured beside her creek. His clothing was well made and decorated with care, suggesting he came from a family of some status within his community. The injuries she could see appeared to be from a fall, possibly from a horse, but there were also older marks that looked like they might have come from some kind of conflict. Most puzzling was the complete absence of anyone searching for him. In Sarah's experience, native families were extremely protective of their children, and the idea that a boy this young would be traveling alone through dangerous weather was almost inconceivable. Something had gone very wrong to put this child in such desperate circumstances. As the November storm gathered strength outside her cabin, Sarah Mitchell found herself committed to nursing a young Apache boy back to health while having no idea who he was, where he came from, or what consequences her decision to help him might bring. She only knew that her medical training and her conscience had left her no choice but to try to save a life, regardless of the complications that decision might create. The blizzard that was building outside would trap them together for the next 7 days, creating a situation that would test everything Sarah thought she knew about herself, her world, and the possibilities for understanding between peoples who had been taught to fear each other. Preparing and narrating this story took a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The blizzard that engulfed Sarah's cabin that November night was unlike anything she had experienced during her 3 years in the Montana Territory. Wind howled around the log walls with a ferocity that made the entire structure creak and groan, while snow drove against the windows with such force that the glass rattled constantly in its frames. But inside the cabin, Sarah Mitchell was fighting a battle that made the storm outside seem secondary to the life and death struggle unfolding beside her fireplace. The Apache boy's condition had deteriorated steadily through the first few hours after she brought him inside. Despite her careful warming techniques, his core temperature remained dangerously low, and his breathing had become so shallow that she had to place her ear close to his chest to detect any signs of life. Twice during the early evening, she thought, she had lost him entirely, only to find a faint pulse when she checked his neck with fingers that had learned to detect the subtlest signs of circulation. Sarah's medical training, learned through years of assisting her father and refined through 3 seasons of frontier doctoring, told her that the next 12 hours would be critical. Severe hypothermia created a cascade of physiological problems that could prove fatal even after the patient's temperature began to rise. Heart rhythm irregularities, kidney failure, and brain swelling were all possibilities that she would have to monitor without the proper equipment or medications that a real hospital could provide. Working by lamplight while the storm raged outside, Sarah established the routine that would govern the next several days. Every 30 minutes, she checked the boy's pulse, breathing, and temperature. She rotated warm stones from the fireplace, wrapping them in cloth and placing them strategically around his body to provide gentle, consistent heat. Most importantly, she began the delicate process of getting fluids into a patient who was barely conscious. The broth she prepared was a recipe her father had taught her for treating severe illness. Beef stock enriched with herbs that aided circulation and digestion. Getting it into the boy required patience and persistence. She would warm small amounts to body temperature, then use a spoon to place tiny quantities on his lips, waiting for the automatic swallowing reflex that indicated his body was still fighting to survive. As the night progressed, Sarah found herself talking to her unconscious patient, partly to stay alert during her vigil, but also because she had read medical texts suggesting that comatose patients might be able to hear and respond to human voices, even when they couldn't respond visibly. "You're going to be all right," she told him as she adjusted his blankets and checked his breathing for what felt like the 100th time. "I don't know how you came to be by my creek, or where your family is, but you're safe now. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm going to take care of you until you're strong enough to go home." The boy's only response was the shallow rise and fall of his chest, but Sarah thought she detected slight improvements as the night wore on. His skin color was gradually improving from the dangerous blue-gray of severe hypothermia to a more normal pale tone. His breathing, while still weak, seemed to be becoming more regular. It was during one of her routine checks, sometime after midnight, that Sarah first noticed the extent of the boy's other injuries. As his body warmed and circulation improved, bruises became visible that had been hidden by the pale color of hypothermia. His left shoulder showed clear signs of dislocation, probably from a fall, and there were cuts on his hands and arms that suggested he had struggled through brush or rocky terrain. But it was the older injuries that troubled Sarah most. Faint scars on his back and arms spoke of violence that had nothing to do with his recent ordeal. These were marks that suggested this child had experienced conflict, possibly warfare, that had left permanent reminders on his young body. The discovery added urgency to questions that Sarah had been trying to avoid. Apache bands in this part of Montana were rare, and when they did appear, it was usually in the context of conflicts with settlers, miners, or military forces. The possibility that this boy was connected to recent hostilities made her decision to help him more complex and potentially dangerous. Sarah had heard the stories that circulated through frontier communities about Apache raids, captured settlers, and military expeditions sent to pacify hostile tribes. But she had also heard different stories from Thomas, who had maintained friendships with some of the mixed-blood families in the valley. These families told of Apache peoples who were trying to adapt to changing circumstances, seeking ways to survive in a world where their traditional ways of life were being systematically destroyed. Looking at the injured child who was fighting for life beside her fireplace, Sarah found it impossible to see him as a representative of any abstract threat. He was simply a boy, probably no older than some of the students Thomas had taught, who needed medical care and human compassion to survive. The storm outside continued with unabated fury, creating a cocoon of isolation that made her cabin feel like the only inhabited place in the world. Snow had drifted against the north wall, high enough to cover the lower windows, and the wind created strange harmonics as it passed through the pine forest surrounding her homestead. The sounds were both beautiful and ominous, reminding Sarah that she was completely cut off from any possibility of help or advice. As dawn approached, marked only by a slight lessening of the darkness outside the snow-covered windows, Sarah allowed herself to feel cautious optimism about her patient's condition. The boy's temperature had stabilized within a more normal range, and his breathing had strengthened noticeably. Most encouraging, he had begun to respond to her voice with slight movements that suggested he was aware of her presence, even if he couldn't yet open his eyes. It was just after sunrise that the boy first spoke. Sarah was changing the warm stones that she used to maintain his body temperature when she heard a whisper so faint she thought she might have imagined it. She leaned closer, and the boy spoke again, this time clearly enough for her to understand that he was speaking in his own language. The words meant nothing to Sarah, but the tone was questioning, possibly confused. She responded in English, keeping her voice gentle and reassuring. "You're safe. You're in my cabin, and I'm taking care of you. You were hurt, but you're going to be all right." The boy's eyes opened slowly, revealing dark brown irises that seemed too large for his thin face. He looked around the cabin with obvious confusion, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings and the white woman who was caring for him. Sarah could see wariness in his expression, but also a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested he understood his complete dependence on her goodwill. "What's your name?" Sarah asked gently, not expecting an answer but hoping to establish some kind of communication. The boy studied her face for a long moment before responding in heavily accented but understandable English. "I am called Running Wolf," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are the woman who found me by the water." The fact that he could speak English surprised Sarah, though she realized it probably shouldn't have. Many native children in the territory had learned English through contact with traders, missionaries, or government officials. His ability to communicate would make caring for him much easier, and might help her understand how he had come to be alone and injured in the wilderness. "Yes, I found you by Willow Creek," Sarah confirmed. "You were very sick from the cold. How do you feel now?" Running Wolf attempted to sit up, then winced and lay back down as his injured shoulder reminded him of his condition. "I hurt," he admitted, "but I am warm now. You saved my life." The simple acknowledgement carried weight that went beyond mere gratitude. In Running Wolf's culture, Sarah realized, saving someone's life created bonds and obligations that extended far beyond the immediate act of rescue. She had entered into a relationship with consequences she couldn't yet fully understand. "Can you tell me how you came to be by the creek?" Sarah asked. "Were you traveling with others? Is someone looking for you?" Running Wolf's expression grew, troubled, and Sarah could see him struggling with how much to reveal to this white woman who had saved his life, but might represent danger to his people. "I was alone," he said finally. "My horse fell. I walked until I could walk no more." The explanation raised more questions than it answered. A 12-year-old Apache boy, traveling alone through Montana winter weather, suggested circumstances that were either extraordinary or tragic. But Sarah could see that pressing for more information would be counterproductive. Running Wolf was still recovering from his ordeal, and trust between them would have to be built gradually. "Well, you're safe." "Now," Sarah said, adjusting his blankets and checking his water cup. "The storm outside is very bad. We'll both be staying in this cabin for several days, so you'll have time to get stronger before you need to worry about anything else." Running Wolf nodded, accepting the inevitable. "You are a medicine woman," he observed. "You know how to heal." Sarah smiled at the designation. "I learned from my father, who was a doctor. I've been helping people in this valley for 3 years." "Your husband?" Running Wolf asked, having noticed the masculine clothing and tools that were still part of the cabin's furnishings. "He died 3 months ago," Sarah said simply. "I live alone now, Running Wolf absorbed this information with the gravity that Sarah was beginning to recognize as characteristic of his personality. Despite his youth, he seemed to understand the implications of situations with a maturity that spoke of difficult experiences. "It is not good for a woman to live alone in this country," he said. "There are dangers." Sarah almost smiled at being lectured about frontier safety by a 12-year-old boy, but she recognized the genuine concern in his voice. "I manage," she said. "I have my cattle, my supplies, and I know how to take care of myself." Outside, the blizzard continued with undiminished intensity, creating a world of swirling white that made it impossible to see beyond the cabin's immediate surroundings. Sarah realized that she and Running Wolf would be sharing this confined space for at least several more days, possibly longer if the storm proved as severe as it appeared. The situation was unprecedented in her experience. She had treated native patients before, but always in circumstances where they returned to their own communities after receiving care. Now, she found herself responsible for a child whose presence in her cabin could be misunderstood by neighbors, territorial authorities, or military officials if word of it spread. But as she watched Running Wolf struggle to eat the broth she prepared for him, Sarah knew that such concerns were secondary to the immediate human need she was addressing. Whatever complications might arise from her decision to shelter this boy, she had made the only choice her conscience and medical training would allow. The storm that trapped them together was just beginning, and neither Sarah nor Running Wolf could have imagined how profoundly their unlikely partnership would change both their lives in the days that followed. The morning of the second day brought no relief from the blizzard that had turned Sarah's cabin into an island of warmth in a sea of frozen wilderness. If anything, the storm seemed to have intensified overnight, with wind speeds that made the log walls shudder and snow so thick that the windows might as well have been painted white. But inside the cabin, something fundamental had shifted between the unlikely pair who found themselves sharing this forced sanctuary. Running Wolf's recovery had been remarkable. His natural resilience, combined with Sarah's careful medical attention, had brought him back from the edge of death with a speed that impressed even her experienced eye. He was sitting up now, able to eat solid food, and his color had returned to normal. More importantly, the wariness that had marked their first conversations was beginning to give way to something approaching trust. "The snow speaks." Running Wolf observed, listening to the wind patterns outside. "It says the storm will last many days more." Sarah paused in her morning routine of checking their supplies and maintaining the fire. "You can tell that from the sound?" "My grandfather taught me to listen to winter storms," the boy explained. "Each pattern of wind tells a story about how long the snow will fall, how deep it will become, and when the sky will clear again." The casual mention of his grandfather was the first specific reference Running Wolf had made to his family, and Sarah recognized it as a small but significant step toward opening up about his background. She had learned, through her years of treating patients on the frontier, that information shared willingly was always more reliable than information extracted through direct questioning. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," she said, settling into the chair beside the fireplace, where she could maintain eye contact without seeming to interrogate. "Did he teach you other things about surviving in winter?" Running Wolf nodded, and for the first time since she had found him, Sarah saw something approaching a smile cross his young face. "He taught me many things. How to find water when streams are frozen, how to build shelter from snow and branches, how to track animals when their trails are covered by new snow. But you were alone when I found you," Sarah observed gently. "Were you separated from your grandfather?" The brief moment of warmth vanished from Running Wolf's expression, replaced by a sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone his age to carry. He was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer, but finally he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather died when the soldiers came to our winter camp. He was trying to protect the children when they shot him." The stark statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had heard stories of military actions against native communities, but they were usually told from the perspective of territorial newspapers that portrayed such events as necessary measures against hostile threats. Hearing the same events, described from the viewpoint of a child who had witnessed them, created a completely different picture. "When did this happen?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. 2 moons ago," Running Wolf replied, "just before the first big snow. The soldiers said we were not supposed to be in that place, that we had to go to the reservation, but it was our winter camp, where our people had stayed for many generations when the cold came." Sarah felt sick as she began to understand the circumstances that had led to Running Wolf being alone in the wilderness. The boy wasn't simply a lost child who had wandered away from his family. He was a refugee from what sounded like a military massacre, possibly one of the pacification operations that territorial authorities conducted against native communities accused of not staying within designated boundaries. "What happened to the rest of your people?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Some were killed, some were taken to the reservation," Running Wolf said, with the matter-of-fact tone that children sometimes use when describing tragedies. "Too large for their understanding. I hid in the rocks above our camp. My grandfather told me to run if the shooting started, to find my father and tell him what happened." The mention of his father opened a new dimension to Running Wolf's story, and Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she began to understand the larger implications of the situation. If this boy's father was still alive and searching for him, it meant that somewhere in the Montana Territory there was an Apache leader who had lost his son and might be willing to do anything to get him back. "Your father wasn't at the winter camp?" Sarah asked. "He was hunting with the young men, trying to find enough meat to last through the cold months," Running Wolf explained. "They had been gone for many days. When I left to find him, I took the horse that my grandfather had given me, but she stepped in a hole and broke her leg 3 days ago. I had to leave her." The practical details of Running Wolf's survival story filled in gaps that made his presence by Sarah's Creek both more understandable and more miraculous. A 12-year-old boy traveling alone through increasingly severe weather, searching for a father who might be anywhere in thousands of square miles of wilderness. The fact that he had survived at all spoke to remarkable determination and skill, but it also meant that Running Wolf's father might indeed be searching for him, and that search could bring consequences that Sarah wasn't prepared to handle. Apache warriors looking for a missing child would not necessarily distinguish between the white woman who had saved his life and the white soldiers who had destroyed his community. "What's your father's name?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer might complicate her situation even further. Running Wolf hesitated, clearly weighing how much he should reveal. Finally, he spoke with obvious pride. "He is called Chief Iron Hawk. He leads our band, what you would call a war chief." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the title certainly did. She was sheltering the son of an Apache war chief whose people had recently been attacked by territorial military forces. If Iron Hawk was indeed searching for his missing son, he would be leading warriors who had every reason to view white settlers as enemies responsible for the destruction of their community. The realization should have terrified Sarah, but instead, she found herself thinking about the boy sitting beside her fireplace, calmly eating the stew she had prepared while describing traumatic events with a composure that spoke of remarkable inner strength. Whatever dangers his father's search might bring, her immediate responsibility was to the child who had been placed in her care by circumstances beyond either of their control. "Running Wolf," she said carefully. "If your father is looking for you, he'll be very worried. When the storm passes, we need to find a way to let him know you're safe." The boy studied her face with an intensity that reminded Sarah of how much more mature he seemed than his chronological age suggested. "You would help me return to my people, even knowing that some of them might not trust you. You're a child who nearly died from cold and injuries," Sarah replied firmly. "I took an oath to help people who need medical care, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "you're my patient now. I'm responsible for making sure you recover completely." Running Wolf nodded slowly, accepting her commitment with the gravity that seemed to characterize all his responses. "My father is a good man," he said. "If you help me return to him safely, he will not forget the debt he owes you." The statement carried implications that Sarah couldn't fully evaluate, but she sensed it represented something significant in Running Wolf's cultural understanding of obligation and honor. She had saved his life, and in doing so, she had apparently created a relationship that extended beyond the immediate medical situation. As the day progressed, their conversations revealed more about both their backgrounds. Sarah told Running Wolf about Thomas, about her life in Ohio before coming west, and about her work as an unofficial doctor for the scattered families of the valley. In return, he shared stories of his childhood, his grandfather's teachings, and the traditional ways of his people that were being threatened by the rapidly changing circumstances of territorial expansion. "Your husband was a teacher," Running Wolf observed at one point. "Like the men who came to our reservation and said they would teach our children to live like white people. Was that good or bad?" Sarah asked, curious about his perspective on educational efforts she had heard described as civilizing missions. "Some learning is good," Running Wolf said thoughtfully. "Knowing your language helps me talk with you now. Understanding your numbers helps when trading with your merchants, but they also wanted us to forget our own language, our own stories, our own ways of honoring the spirits. That is not good." The conversation gave Sarah insights into the complex pressures facing native communities that went far beyond the immediate violence of military conflicts. The systematic attempt to erase indigenous cultures through education, religious conversion, and forced assimilation was creating resistance that sometimes manifested as warfare, but more often appeared as the kind of quiet persistence that Running Wolf himself represented. As evening approached and they prepared for their second night together, Sarah realized that her understanding of the situation in the Montana Territory was being fundamentally altered by her conversations with this remarkable boy. The newspaper accounts of savage hostilities and necessary military actions were being replaced by a much more complex picture of peoples struggling to survive the destruction of their traditional ways of life. Outside, the blizzard continued, with undiminished fury, creating a world of swirling white that seemed to exist beyond normal time and space. Inside the cabin, a white widow and an Apache boy were discovering that understanding between different cultures was not only possible, but could emerge naturally when people were willing to listen to each other's stories with open hearts and minds. The storm that had brought them together was also protecting them from the complications that would inevitably arise when the outside world intruded on their unlikely sanctuary. For now, they existed in a space where human need and compassion could triumph over the prejudices and conflicts that divided their peoples. But both Sarah and Running Wolf understood that the storm would eventually end, and when it did, they would have to face the consequences of their growing friendship in a world that might not approve of the bonds they were forming. The third day of the blizzard brought an unexpected development that would deepen the bond between Sarah and Running Wolf while revealing skills that neither had known the other possessed. Sarah woke to discover that the storm had torn away part of the cabin's roof structure, allowing snow to accumulate in the corner where she stored her medical supplies and preserved foods. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was serious enough to threaten their safety if not addressed quickly. Snow was melting from the heat of the cabin, creating pools of water that could freeze solid when temperatures dropped during the night. More critically, several containers of preserved meat and vegetables were now exposed to moisture that would ruin them within days. "We have to repair this before we lose our food supply," Sarah said, staring up at the gap where wind-driven snow was still entering the cabin. Running Wolf, who had been regaining strength steadily, pulled himself to his feet and examined the damage with an expert eye that surprised Sarah. "I can fix this," he said with quiet confidence. "My grandfather taught me how to repair winter shelters when storms damaged them." What followed was a revelation of practical skills that challenged every assumption Sarah had made about the capabilities of a 12-year-old boy. Using materials available in and around the cabin, Running Wolf designed a temporary repair that was both ingenious and effective. He showed Sarah how to weave pine boughs into a tight mat that could shed water while providing insulation. Using strips of leather cut from unused portions of his own clothing, he created a lashing system that could secure the repair against winds that might otherwise tear it away. Most impressively, he demonstrated techniques for working in sub-zero temperatures that allowed them to complete the repair without losing dangerous amounts of body heat. "Where did you learn all this?" Sarah asked as they worked together, following his instructions while marveling at the sophistication of indigenous survival knowledge. "Living through 15 winters teaches you many things," Running Wolf replied. "My people move with the seasons, and our shelters must be built quickly and repaired when storms damage them. A child who cannot help with such work becomes a burden that the band cannot afford." The casual reference to 15 winters stopped Sarah short. "You're 15? I thought you were 12. Running Wolf looked puzzled for a moment, then understanding dawned on his face. "You count years differently than we do. I have lived through 15 winter seasons, but your way of counting would make me 12 winters old, I think." The clarification didn't just resolve a minor confusion about age. It revealed fundamental differences in how their respective cultures measured time and maturity. In Running Wolf's world, survival skills and practical contributions to community welfare were more important markers of development than chronological age. As they completed the roof repair, Sarah found herself reassessing her patient's capabilities. The boy, who had nearly died from exposure 3 days earlier, was revealing himself to be remarkably competent in precisely the skills their situation required. His knowledge of winter survival, construction techniques, and resource management was not just theoretical, but practical knowledge gained through years of living in harsh conditions. The work also created opportunities for Running Wolf to learn about Sarah's own background and skills. As they organized the water-damaged supplies and assessed what could be saved, he watched her systematic approach to inventory management and preservation techniques with obvious interest. "You think like a medicine woman," he observed, watching her carefully examine each container to determine its condition. "Not just healing, but knowing what will keep people alive when healing is not enough." Sarah smiled at the assessment. "My father taught me that a good doctor has to understand nutrition, sanitation, and resource management, as well as treatment of injuries. In frontier conditions, preventing illness is often more important than curing it." The conversation led to an exchange of knowledge that benefited both of them. Sarah shared techniques for food preservation, water purification, and basic sanitation that were based on scientific understanding rather than traditional practice. Running Wolf contributed indigenous knowledge about winter survival, weather, prediction, and the medicinal properties of plants that grew in the Montana Territory. "Your people use willow bark for pain," Sarah said, recognizing one of his descriptions. My father taught me about that too, but he called it salicin. It's the same medicine that civilized doctors use, just in a different form. Different words for the same knowledge, Running Wolf agreed. My grandfather said that wisdom appears in many forms, but the truth underneath is always the same. The philosophical observation sparked a discussion that continued through the afternoon and into the evening, revealing depths of thought and understanding that impressed both participants. Despite their different backgrounds, they discovered shared perspectives on human nature, the relationship between people and their environment, and the importance of community in ensuring survival. The fourth day brought the first signs that the blizzard might be beginning to weaken. The wind patterns that Running Wolf had been monitoring showed subtle changes that suggested the storm system was moving past their area. Snow was still falling, but not with the driving intensity that had characterized the previous 3 days. Tomorrow, maybe the day after, the sky will start to clear, Running Wolf predicted, listening to sounds that Sarah was only beginning to recognize as meaningful. When it does, I will need to try to signal my father that I am alive. The prospect of contact with the outside world brought both relief and anxiety. Sarah was eager to end their isolation and ensure that Running Wolf could be reunited with his family. But she was also aware that their peaceful sanctuary was about to be exposed to forces that might not view their unlikely partnership with the same acceptance they had discovered. "How will you signal him?" Sarah asked. "Smoke signals. If the wind allows, my father will have sent scouts to watch for signs from high places where they can see far across the country. If I can build a fire on the ridge behind your cabin and send the right messages, they will know where to find me." The practical discussion of signaling techniques led to more complex conversations about what would happen when Chief Ironhawk arrived. Running Wolf clearly expected his father to come personally, along with warriors who would be prepared for trouble. The idea of armed Apache fighters approaching her isolated cabin should have terrified Sarah, but she found herself more concerned about ensuring peaceful contact than about personal danger. "Will your father trust me?" she asked directly. "I'm a white woman who's been alone with his son for several days. Some people might misunderstand that situation." Running Wolf considered the question with the gravity he brought to all serious topics. "My father is a wise man, but he has reasons to distrust white people. The soldiers who attacked our winter camp were following orders from your government. He will be grateful that you saved my life, but he will also be cautious about your motives. What can I do to show him that my intentions are good? Be honest about what happened. Tell him exactly how you found me and how you cared for me. Do not try to hide anything or make yourself seem better than you are. My father respects truth, even when it is uncomfortable." The advice revealed Running Wolf's sophisticated understanding of cross-cultural communication and the delicate dynamics that would govern the approaching encounter. Despite his youth, he had clearly observed enough interactions between his people and white settlers to understand the challenges involved in building trust across cultural boundaries. As evening approached, they began preparing for what might be their last night alone together. The experience of the past 4 days had created a bond that transcended the usual relationships between patient and caregiver, or between representatives of supposedly hostile cultures. Sarah found herself dreading the end of their enforced partnership, not because she feared the arrival of Chief Ironhawk, but because she had come to value the unique perspective that Running Wolf brought to their conversations. His combination of practical wisdom, cultural knowledge, and mature understanding had enriched her own thinking in ways she hadn't expected. "I'm going to miss our talks," she admitted, as they settled in for the evening. "You've taught me things about this country and its people that I never would have learned otherwise." Running Wolf nodded solemnly. "You have taught me much as well. I will tell my father about the white woman who saved my life and treated me with the respect due to a guest in her lodge. Perhaps such stories will help him remember that not all of your people are enemies. The mutual respect they had developed seemed to carry significance beyond their individual relationship. In the territory where cultural conflicts were increasingly common and violent, their successful partnership offered evidence that understanding and cooperation were possible when people approached each other with open minds and genuine concern for human welfare. Outside, the storm continued, but with diminishing intensity that suggested their isolation was nearing its end. Tomorrow or the next day would bring new challenges and complications, but it would also bring opportunities to demonstrate that the bridge they had built between their worlds could survive contact with the larger forces that sought to keep their peoples apart. The lessons they had learned from each other during the blizzard would soon be tested in circumstances that neither could fully predict or control. The fifth morning dawned with a silence that was almost shocking after 4 days of howling wind and driving snow. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows for the first time since Running Wolf's arrival, and when she stepped outside to assess the storm's aftermath, she found herself in a world transformed by winter's artistry. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls to heights that reached nearly to the roofline, creating sculpted curves that looked more like natural geological formations than accumulated precipitation. The pine forest surrounding her homestead had been transformed into a cathedral of white-laden branches that sparkled like crystal in the morning light. Most remarkably, the air was still, not the oppressive stillness that precedes severe weather, but the peaceful quiet that follows nature's greatest displays of power. Running Wolf emerged from the cabin behind her, moving with the fluid grace that marked his complete recovery from the hypothermia that had nearly claimed his life. His eyes swept the landscape with the practiced assessment of someone trained to read environmental conditions for survival information. "It is finished," he said with quiet satisfaction. "The storm has moved past us toward the eastern mountains. Today we can begin to signal my father." The prospect of contact with the outside world filled Sarah with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Their 5 days of isolation had created a unique sanctuary where cultural differences had given way to mutual respect and genuine friendship. Once that sanctuary was breached by the arrival of Chief Ironhawk and his warriors, everything would change in ways that neither of them could fully predict. But Running Wolf's eagerness to reconnect with his family was obvious, and Sarah understood that prolonging their isolation would be selfish. The boy had been separated from his people under traumatic circumstances, and his father was undoubtedly searching with increasing desperation as days passed without word of his son's fate. "What do you need to create the signals?" Sarah asked, focusing on practical preparations rather than her own emotional complexity about their approaching separation. "Dry wood that will burn hot and create much smoke," Running Wolf explained. "Green pine boughs to control the smoke and make it visible from far away, and a high place where the signals can be seen across the valley." Sarah knew immediately where they would need to go. The ridge behind her cabin rose nearly 500 feet above the valley floor, offering commanding views in all directions. On clear days, she had been able to see mountain peaks that were 50 miles away from that vantage point. It would be perfect for smoke signals, but reaching it would require a difficult climb through snow that was waist-deep in places. They spent the morning preparing for the ascent. Sarah gathered supplies that would allow them to build and maintain a signal fire, while Running Wolf used techniques his grandfather had taught him to create improvised snowshoes from pine branches and strips of leather. The devices wouldn't match factory-made equipment, but they would distribute their weight enough to prevent them from sinking completely into the deep snow. The climb to the ridge was exhausting but exhilarating. Sarah had never attempted such a journey in winter conditions, and she found herself gaining new appreciation for the physical demands that frontier life placed on indigenous peoples who moved regularly through such terrain. Running Wolf, despite his recent ordeal, moved through the snow with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience in similar conditions. "How often did your band travel in winter?" Sarah asked during one of their rest stops, genuinely curious. "About the lifestyle that had produced such remarkable adaptability. We followed the herds and the seasons," Running Wolf explained. "In summer, we moved often to find good hunting and to avoid conflicts with other bands or with your people. In winter, we stayed in protected places, but we still had to travel to find game or to escape from soldiers who would not let us rest." The casual reference to military harassment reminded Sarah of the larger context that had brought Running Wolf to her cabin. His people weren't simply choosing a nomadic lifestyle, they were being forced to move constantly by pressures that made permanent settlement impossible. When they reached the ridge, the view was spectacular enough to make both of them pause in wonder, despite the serious purpose of their climb. The Bitterroot Valley stretched below them like a vast white carpet, broken by the dark lines of creeks and rivers that remained unfrozen. To the north, the peaks of the Mission Mountains rose like frozen cathedrals against a sky so blue it seemed artificial. To the south, the Sapphire Range created a barrier that seemed to extend beyond the edge of the world. "From here, scouts can see riders approaching from any direction," Running Wolf observed, his tactical assessment revealing the military thinking that was second nature to someone raised in a culture under constant threat. "My father will have men watching from places like this." They built the signal fire with careful attention to Running Wolf's detailed instructions. The base was constructed from dry wood that would burn hot and clean, creating the intense heat needed to lift smoke high into the still air. Green pine boughs were arranged around the fire in patterns that would allow Running Wolf to control the smoke's density and duration. "Each signal has meaning," he explained as he prepared to light the fire. 3 quick puffs mean "I am alive and safe." 5 long clouds mean "come to this place." 7 puffs in a special pattern identify me specifically to my father. The sophistication of the communication system impressed Sarah. She had heard of native smoke signals, but had assumed they were simple alerts rather than complex messages capable of conveying detailed information across vast distances. When running, Wolf lit the fire. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A column of white smoke rose straight up in the still air, reaching heights where it could be seen for dozens of miles. Using a blanket to control the smoke's release, Running Wolf began sending his carefully coded messages. 3 quick puffs. "I am alive and safe." A pause, then 5 long, sustained clouds. "Come to this place." Another pause, then the 7-puff sequence that would identify him to his father. A complex pattern of short and long smoke releases that carried as much specific information as a written letter. "How long before they might respond?" Sarah asked, scanning the horizons for answering signals. "If scouts are watching from the high places, they could see these signals within the hour," Running Wolf replied. "But it will take time for the message to reach my father and more time for him to organize a search party and travel here. Perhaps 2 days, perhaps 3. The timeline gave Sarah a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. She wanted Running Wolf to be reunited with his family, but she also valued every remaining hour of their unique partnership. More practically, she needed time to prepare for an encounter that could easily go wrong if Chief Ironhawk misinterpreted her role in his son's rescue. As they maintained the signal fire and watched for responses, Running Wolf shared more details about his father and the warriors who would likely accompany him. Chief Ironhawk was described as a leader who combined traditional wisdom with practical understanding of the changing world his people faced. He had fought against white encroachment when fighting seemed necessary, but he had also negotiated, treaties when negotiation offered better prospects for his people's survival. He is not like some of the younger war leaders who believe that all white people are enemies, Running Wolf explained. But he has seen enough betrayal and violence to be very careful about trusting anyone from your culture. What should I expect when he arrives? Sarah asked directly. He will come with enough warriors to protect against treachery, but not so many as to seem like an attack, Running Wolf said thoughtfully. He will want to hear the full story of how you found me and why you helped me. He will judge you by your actions and your honesty, not by the color of your skin or the language you speak. The assessment was both reassuring and challenging. Sarah understood that she would be evaluated according to standards that might be very different from those she was accustomed to, but she also sensed that those standards might be more fair and comprehensive than the superficial judgments that often characterized interactions between cultures. As afternoon turned toward evening, they were rewarded by the sight of answering smoke signals rising from a peak 20 miles to the southeast. The response was brief but unmistakable, 3 puffs followed by a single long cloud that Running Wolf interpreted as acknowledgement and a promise of action. They have seen my signals and recognized my identification, he said with obvious relief. My father knows that I am alive, and he will come for me. The successful communication marked the end of their isolation and the beginning of a new phase that would test everything they had learned about each other during their enforced partnership. As they prepared to descend from the ridge, Sarah found herself hoping that the understanding they had achieved could survive the complications that would inevitably arise when their private sanctuary was invaded by the larger conflicts that divided their peoples. The smoke signals rising from distant peaks were beautiful against the clear winter sky, but they also represented the approaching end of one of the most meaningful relationships Sarah had ever experienced. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but it would also bring opportunities to demonstrate that the bridge they had built between their worlds was strong enough to withstand the forces that sought to keep their cultures apart. The 6th morning brought crystalline air so clear that distant mountains seemed close enough to touch, and a tension that filled Sarah's cabin like an invisible presence. Running Wolf had spent most of the night awake, listening to sounds that Sarah couldn't detect, but that apparently carried meaning to ears trained in wilderness survival. He was expecting his father's arrival soon, possibly as early as that afternoon. "They are close," he announced as Sarah prepared their morning meal. "I heard horses moving through snow, very carefully, maybe 2 hours before dawn. My father's scouts are watching your cabin now." The knowledge that they were under observation should have frightened Sarah, but instead she felt an odd sense of relief. The approaching encounter would end the uncertainty that had been building since their successful signal exchange. Whatever challenges Chief Ironhawk's arrival might bring, at least they would be facing them directly rather than anticipating them. "What should I do to prepare?" Sarah asked, recognizing that the next few hours might determine not just Running Wolf's safe return to his people, but also whether her actions would be seen as helpful or threatening by warriors who had every reason to distrust white settlers. Running Wolf considered the question with the gravity he brought to all serious matters. "Be yourself," he said finally. "Do not try to seem different than you are. My father will know if you are hiding something or pretending to be better than you are. Show him the truth about how you found me and how you cared for me." The advice was both simple and profound, but it also highlighted the cultural gap that Sarah would have to bridge. Her truth included medical training that might seem like witchcraft to people unfamiliar with European medical practices. Her motivations included Christian beliefs about charity and service that might be interpreted as attempts at religious conversion. Even her decision to live alone in an isolated cabin represented choices that might seem incomprehensible to people. from a culture that valued community and extended family relationships. But Running Wolf's confidence in his father's fairness encouraged Sarah to hope that honest explanation might overcome cultural misunderstandings. During their 6 days together, she had learned that Apache culture valued directness and authenticity more than diplomatic politeness. If she could present her actions clearly and without self-serving embellishment, she might earn the respect that would allow Running Wolf to return safely to his people. As morning progressed into afternoon, Running Wolf became increasingly alert to sounds and signs that remained invisible to Sarah. His posture changed subtly, taking on the alertness of someone who expected significant events to unfold at any moment. He positioned himself near the cabin's single window that faced the forest trail, watching with intensity that reminded Sarah of how wild animals behave when they sense the approach of something that could be either opportunity or threat. "How many men will your father bring?" Sarah asked, partly from curiosity but mostly to gauge what kind of reception she should expect. "Enough to protect against treachery, not so many as to seem like war party," Running Wolf replied, echoing his earlier assessment. "Maybe 6 warriors, maybe 8. All of them will be men my father trusts completely, and all of them will be ready to fight if they think I am in danger." The practical reality of facing 8 Apache warriors, all of them suspicious of her motives and prepared for combat, struck Sarah with new force. These wouldn't be curiosity seekers or casual visitors. They would be elite fighters accompanying their chief on a mission to recover his missing son from potentially hostile territory. "Running Wolf," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something important. When your father arrives, I'm going to let you do most of the talking. You know your people and their customs better than I do. If there are things I should say or do, or things I should avoid, you need to guide me." The boy nodded approvingly. "That is wise. My father will want to hear my story first, told in my own words. He will ask you questions, but he will judge you more by how you act than by what you say." The afternoon passed slowly, with both of them engaged in activities that seemed normal but were actually preparations for the approaching encounter. Sarah organized her medical supplies, partly to have them readily available if anyone in the arriving party needed treatment, but also to demonstrate the legitimate medical purpose that had guided her care of Running Wolf. She also prepared food that could serve a group of 8 or 10 people, reasoning that offering hospitality might help establish the peaceful intentions that would be crucial to a successful meeting. The meal she planned was simple but substantial: venison stew, cornbread and coffee, strong enough to revive travelers who had been riding through winter conditions. Running Wolf spent his time crafting something that Sarah didn't immediately recognize, but that clearly had cultural significance. Using materials he found around the cabin, he was creating what appeared to be a decorative object made from braided leather, carved wood, and small stones arranged in specific patterns. "What are you making?" Sarah asked, watching him work with obvious expertise despite his young age. "A gift for you," he replied without looking up from his careful work. "In my culture, when someone saves a life, the debt can only be repaid with something made by the person whose life was saved. This will show my father that I understand the obligation I owe you." The explanation revealed another layer of cultural complexity that Sarah hadn't anticipated. The gift wasn't simply a token of gratitude. It was a formal acknowledgement of debt that would be recognized by Chief Ironhawk as evidence of his son's understanding of traditional obligations. "What does the design mean?" Sarah asked, studying the intricate patterns that Running Wolf was creating. "The leather represents the bond between us that cannot be broken," he explained. "The wood comes from trees that grow beside water, showing that you found me near your creek and brought me to safety. The stones are arranged to show the 4 directions, meaning that no matter where I travel, I will remember what you did for me. The symbolic complexity of the gift moved Sarah more deeply than simple thanks could have done. Running Wolf was creating something that would communicate to his father not just his gratitude, but also his understanding of the cultural significance of her actions within Apache traditions. As late afternoon sunlight began to slant through the cabin windows, both of them became aware of a change in the quality of silence outside. It wasn't that they could hear anything specific, but rather that the natural sounds of the forest had subtly altered in ways that suggested the presence of observers who were skilled enough to move without detection. "They are here, running," Wolf said quietly, setting aside his gift-making to take a position near the window. "My father likes to watch before he acts, to understand situations completely before he commits himself." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized that the encounter she had been anticipating for 2 days was finally beginning. Somewhere in the forest around her cabin, Chief Ironhawk and his warriors were assessing the situation, probably trying to determine whether the white woman who claimed to have saved his son represented genuine assistance or some form of elaborate trap. The waiting was almost unbearable. Sarah found herself second-guessing every decision she had made since finding Running Wolf by the creek. Should she have tried to take him to the territorial authorities rather than caring for him herself? Should she have attempted to signal his people sooner? Should she have prepared differently for this meeting? But Running Wolf's calm confidence helped steady her nerves. The boy, who had been near death 6 days earlier, was now completely recovered and obviously eager to be reunited with his family. Whatever mistakes she might have made, her fundamental decision to save his life had clearly been correct. "When they come to the door," Running Wolf said, still watching the forest, "let me go outside first. I need to show them that I am well and that I came to you willingly. After they see that I am safe, my father will want to speak with you." The practical guidance was exactly what Sarah needed. She positioned herself where she could respond quickly when the moment came, but also where she wouldn't appear threatening to warriors who would be evaluating every detail of her appearance and behavior. As shadows lengthened and evening approached, the quality of waiting changed from anticipation to certainty. The encounter that would determine the outcome of their unlikely partnership was about to begin, and both Sarah and Running Wolf understood that the next hour would test everything they had learned about each other during their 6 days of enforced companionship. The forest around Sarah's cabin held its breath, waiting for the moment when 2 worlds would meet in circumstances that could lead either to understanding or to tragedy. The 7th dawn brought with it a silence so profound that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Running Wolf had barely slept, positioning himself by the window where he could monitor the approaches to the cabin while maintaining the alertness that 6 days of recovery had restored to his young body. As the first light touched the snow-covered clearing around Sarah's homestead, he suddenly straightened with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Now," he said simply, "my father comes." Sarah moved to the window beside him and saw what her untrained eyes had missed during the long night of waiting. Figures were emerging from the forest with such fluid grace that they seemed to materialize from the landscape itself rather than approach through it. 8 Apache warriors, mounted on horses that moved through the deep snow with sure-footed confidence, were advancing toward the cabin in a formation that spoke of both caution and controlled power. At the center of the group rode a man whose bearing immediately identified him as Chief Ironhawk. He was taller than the others, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of physical presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His clothing was practical winter gear rather than ceremonial dress, but the quality of the materials and the careful decoration marked him as someone of significant status within his community. What struck Sarah most forcefully was the resemblance between father and son. Chief Iron Hawk possessed the same intelligent alertness that characterized Running Wolf, the same careful assessment of his surroundings, and the same combination of wariness and confidence that she had come to associate with Apache survival skills. "He looks like you," Sarah observed, trying to keep her voice steady despite the anxiety that was making her hands tremble. "People say I look like him," Running Wolf replied with obvious pride. "But he is a great leader. I am still learning to be worthy of his teaching." The approaching warriors halted their horses about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to demonstrate their peaceful intentions, but far enough away to allow for tactical response if the situation proved dangerous. Chief Iron Hawk dismounted and spoke briefly with his companions in their own language, then began walking toward the cabin alone. "This is good," Running Wolf said with relief. "If he thought you were a threat, he would not approach without his warriors. He comes to talk, not to fight." Running Wolf moved toward the cabin door, pausing to look back at Sarah with an expression that mixed gratitude, affection, and concern. "Remember what I told you. Be honest about everything. Do not try to make yourself seem more important than you are. My father respects truth above all else." Sarah nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to trust her voice. The boy who had been near death when she found him by the creek was about to return to his people, ending their unlikely partnership, but also validating her decision to risk everything to save his life. Running Wolf opened the cabin door and stepped outside, moving with the measured dignity that Sarah had learned to recognize as his way of handling significant moments. Chief Iron Hawk stopped about 20 feet away, and for several heartbeats, father and son simply looked at each other across the space that represented 6 days of separation, worry, and uncertainty. Then Chief Iron Hawk spoke a single word in Apache, and Running Wolf responded with what was clearly a formal greeting that acknowledged both his father's authority and his own safe return. The exchange was brief, but obviously meaningful, establishing that the boy was indeed unharmed and that the reunion was genuine. Chief Iron Hawk's attention then turned to Sarah, who had followed Running Wolf outside, despite her nervousness about how she would be received. The Apache leader studied her with eyes that seemed to see far more than her physical appearance, evaluating her posture, her expression, and the way she interacted with his son. "You are the woman who found my son," Chief Iron Hawk said in English. That was accented but perfectly clear. His voice carried the authority of leadership, but also a warmth that suggested he was prepared to be grateful rather than suspicious. "Yes," Sarah replied simply, following Running Wolf's advice about directness. "I found him by my creek 6 days ago. He was nearly dead from cold and injuries. I brought him into my cabin and cared for him until he recovered." Chief Iron Hawk nodded slowly, absorbing her words while continuing his careful assessment of her demeanor. "My son has been missing for many days. We feared he was dead. The storm that passed through this valley was severe enough to kill even experienced travelers." "He almost did die," Sarah said honestly. "The first night was very dangerous, but he's strong and he fought to survive. All I did was provide warmth and medical care." "Medical care," Chief Iron Hawk repeated, and Sarah realized that this might be a concept that required explanation. "I learned healing from my father, who was a doctor," she explained. "I know how to treat injuries and illness. Your son had hypothermia, dangerous cold sickness, and also injuries from falling from his horse." Chief Iron Hawk listened to her explanation with obvious interest, then spoke briefly to Running Wolf in Apache. The boy responded at length, clearly providing a detailed account of his experience and Sarah's treatment. During the conversation, Sarah noticed that several of the mounted warriors had moved closer, close enough to intervene quickly if the situation turned hostile, but still maintaining the respectful distance that indicated they were following their chief's lead in treating this as a peaceful encounter. When Running Wolf finished his account, Chief Ironhawk turned back to Sarah, with an expression that had shifted noticeably toward respect and gratitude. "My son tells me that you not only saved his life, but that you treated him with the honor due to a guest in your lodge. This is not something we have experienced often from your people." The reference to previous experiences with white settlers reminded Sarah of the broader context that surrounded their meeting. Chief Ironhawk and his people had recently suffered a military attack that had destroyed their winter camp and scattered their community. Their natural response to encountering another white person would be suspicion and hostility. "I'm sorry about what happened to your people," Sarah said, addressing the underlying tension directly. "My son told me about the attack on your winter camp. That was wrong, and I understand why you might not trust me." Chief Ironhawk's expression showed surprise at her direct acknowledgement of the injustice his people had suffered. "You know of this?" "Running Wolf told me about his grandfather's death and how your people were scattered," Sarah replied. "He also told me that he was trying to find you when his horse fell, and he became lost in the storm." The conversation was interrupted by Running Wolf, who approached his father carrying the gift he had been crafting during their final day together. He spoke formally in Apache, then switched to English so that Sarah could understand. "Father, I present this gift to the woman who saved my life. It is made according to our customs to acknowledge the debt I owe her and to show that I understand the obligation that such kindness creates." Chief Ironhawk examined the carefully crafted object with obvious approval, noting the symbolic elements that Running Wolf had incorporated into its design. He spoke to his son in Apache, clearly praising both the workmanship and the cultural appropriateness of the gesture. Then he turned to Sarah and held out the gift with formal ceremony. "My son has created this according to our traditions. It represents his understanding that you have given him life, and that such a gift creates bonds that cannot be broken by time or distance." Sarah accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, both from emotion and from the significance of the moment. The object was beautiful in its symbolic complexity, but more importantly, it represented Running Wolf's formal acknowledgement of their relationship and its meaning within Apache cultural understanding. "Thank you," she said to Running Wolf, then looked directly at Chief Ironhawk. "Your son has been a remarkable guest. He taught me as much as I taught him. I will treasure this gift and the memory of our time together." Chief Ironhawk nodded approvingly, then made a gesture that brought one of his warriors forward. The man dismounted and approached, carrying something that made Sarah's breath catch in surprise. It was a horse, not just any horse, but a magnificent paint mare whose coat displayed the distinctive patterns that gave painted horses their name. The animal's coloring was spectacular, a base of pure white marked with large patches of deep brown and black that created patterns so striking they seemed almost intentional rather than natural. "This is for you," Chief Ironhawk said simply. "Among my people, when someone saves the life of a chief's son, the debt can only be repaid with a gift that matches the value of what was given. You gave my son his life. I give you a horse that will serve you well in this country, where life often depends on mobility and speed." Sarah stared at the beautiful animal, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gesture and its cultural significance. She understood enough about frontier life to know that a horse of this quality represented wealth, freedom, and survival capability that could make the difference between life and death in Montana Territory conditions. I can't accept something so valuable," she stammered, but Chief Ironhawk held up a hand to stop her protest. "To refuse this gift would be to dishonor the debt my son owes you," he said firmly but kindly. "You saved his life when you could have chosen to ignore his need. You cared for him when you could have turned him away. You treated him with respect when you could have seen him as an enemy. Such actions deserve recognition that matches their importance." The formality of the presentation and the obvious sincerity of Chief Ironhawk's gratitude moved Sarah to tears. She had saved Running Wolf's life because her medical training and conscience had left her no choice. But the Apache understanding of her actions invested them with significance that went far beyond her own understanding. As she accepted the horse's lead rope from the warrior who had brought the animal forward, Sarah realized that she was participating in a ceremony that would be remembered and retold within Apache oral tradition. Her simple act of medical charity had become part of a story that would demonstrate the possibility of understanding and cooperation between peoples who were usually portrayed as natural enemies. But Chief Ironhawk was not finished with his formal acknowledgments. As Sarah stood beside the magnificent painted horse, still overwhelmed by the generosity of the initial gift, the Apache leader gestured toward his mounted warriors. What happened next revealed the careful planning that had gone into this encounter and the depth of respect that Running Wolf's rescue had earned. The warriors began unloading additional items from their pack horses, each piece representing hours of skilled craftsmanship and cultural significance. Leather goods that showcased the finest Apache artistry, intricately decorated saddles, bridles with silver conchos that caught the afternoon light, and parfleches painted with designs that told stories of successful hunts and honored ancestors. "These are made by the women of our band," Chief Ironhawk explained, as each item was carefully arranged for Sarah's inspection. "They wish to contribute to the debt we owe you. In our culture, the entire community shares responsibility for honoring those who help our children." Sarah examined the beautiful craftsmanship with growing amazement. Each piece represented not just functional equipment, but artistic expression that transformed practical items into works of cultural significance. The parfleches alone would have been valuable trade goods anywhere in the territory, but their symbolic meaning as gifts from Apache women elevated them beyond mere commercial worth. "This is far too generous," Sarah protested, though she was beginning to understand that such protests were expected rather than discouraged in Apache gift-giving ceremonies. "Generosity is measured by the value of what was preserved, not by the cost of replacement," Chief Ironhawk replied with patient dignity. "You preserved my son's life, his future contributions to our people, and the continuation of his bloodline. How do we calculate the worth of such preservation?" Running Wolf stepped forward, clearly prepared to explain another aspect of Apache culture that would help Sarah understand the significance of what was happening. In our traditions, when someone saves a life, they become responsible for that life's future actions, but they also become entitled to share in that life's achievements. "You are now part of my family's honor." The concept was foreign to Sarah's European-influenced understanding of individual responsibility, but she could see its logic within a culture that valued community interconnection over personal independence. By saving Running Wolf's life, she had become invested in his future success and entitled to share in the recognition that success would bring. Chief Ironhawk produced something from his own pack that made Sarah catch her breath in surprise. It was a detailed map drawn on prepared buffalo hide, showing routes through Apache territory that she could never have discovered on her own. But this wasn't just geographical information, it was political protection made visible. "This map shows safe passages through country that my people control," Chief Ironhawk explained. "Any Apache warrior who sees you carrying this will know that you travel under our protection. It will allow you to reach communities that could benefit from your healing knowledge." The implication struck Sarah with sudden force. She was being offered access to native settlements throughout the territory, communities that had never been served by white medical practitioners because of the cultural barriers and mutual suspicions that made such contact dangerous for both sides. "Would you trust me to enter your villages?" Sarah asked, hardly believing what she was hearing. "My son has convinced me that you see people as individuals who need help, not as members of groups to be feared or conquered," Chief Ironhawk replied. Such understanding is rare among your people and precious to ours." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of an elderly Apache woman who had been traveling with the warrior party but had remained in the background until this moment. Her clothing and bearing marked her as someone of significant status, possibly a medicine woman or senior leader whose presence added weight to the formal ceremonies taking place. Chief Ironhawk spoke to her respectfully in Apache, then turned to Sarah with obvious pride. "This is Singing Bird, my sister and the medicine woman of our band. She wished to meet the white woman who saved my son's life." Singing Bird approached Sarah with the measured dignity that seemed characteristic of Apache formal interactions, but her eyes held warmth that spoke of genuine gratitude rather than mere ceremonial obligation. She spoke in Apache, her words carrying emotional weight that transcended language barriers. "She says that she has prepared medicines for you, Chief." Ironhawk translated. "Herbs and treatments that our people have used for generations to heal ailments that affect those who live in this harsh country. She offers to teach you their uses if you are willing to learn." The offer represented something unprecedented in Sarah's experience, the opportunity to learn indigenous medical knowledge from a practitioner whose expertise had been developed through generations of accumulated wisdom. The combination of her European medical training with traditional Apache healing knowledge could create treatment capabilities that surpassed either system alone. "I would be deeply honored to learn from her," Sarah replied, addressing Singing Bird directly despite the language barrier. The elderly medicine woman smiled and nodded, apparently understanding Sarah's sincerity even without translation. Running Wolf spoke up, clearly excited by the possibilities that were emerging from this meeting. "Singing Bird has treated injuries and illnesses that your medicine books don't describe. Desert sickness, snake bite cures, treatments for problems that come from living in high mountain country. And you could teach her about the healing techniques that saved my life." The prospect of medical collaboration between cultures opened vistas that Sarah had never imagined. Her isolated practice, which had served scattered ranching families throughout the valley, could expand to include native communities that had previously been beyond her reach. More importantly, she could contribute to a sharing of knowledge that might benefit everyone who lived in the challenging environment of the Montana Territory. Chief Ironhawk produced one final item that completed his formal acknowledgement of debt. It was a decorated war shirt, obviously of great personal significance, that he presented to Sarah with ceremony that indicated its importance within Apache culture. "This belonged to my father, Running Wolf's grandfather," he explained. "It carries the protection of our ancestors and the respect of our people. Wearing it will identify you as someone who has earned the right to move safely through Apache country." Sarah accepted the shirt with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that she was receiving something that represented generations of family history and cultural significance. The garment wasn't just protective clothing. It was a badge of acceptance that would be recognized throughout Apache territory. But the most significant development came when Chief Ironhawk made an offer that would transform Sarah's understanding of her future possibilities. "I propose that when the seasons allow, you come to our summer gathering where all the bands meet together. Singing Bird could teach you our healing methods, and you could share your knowledge with medicine people from many different groups." The invitation to attend the great summer gathering was extraordinary. Few white people had ever been permitted to witness the ceremonies and councils that brought together Apache bands from across the territory. Sarah would be entering a world that most of her contemporaries considered mythical or hostile, but which Running Wolf's rescue had opened to her as a place of potential cooperation and mutual learning. "When would this gathering take place?" Sarah asked, her mind racing with the implications of such an opportunity. "When the snow melts and the high valleys become passable," Chief Ironhawk replied. Usually during the season you call July, the gathering lasts for many days and includes ceremonies, councils, and celebrations that bring our scattered people together. Running Wolf added his own enthusiasm to his father's invitation. You could bring some of your medical supplies and books. Our medicine people would be very interested in learning about treatments that come from your world, especially techniques for treating injuries that happen during warfare or hunting accidents. The practical applications of such medical collaboration were immediately apparent to Sarah. Apache warriors and hunters faced dangers that were different from those encountered by farming families, and their traditional medicine had developed specialized treatments that could benefit anyone living in frontier conditions. At the same time, her surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge could address injuries and illnesses that overwhelmed traditional healing methods. As afternoon moved toward evening, the formal ceremonies concluded with arrangements for future contact. Chief Ironhawk designated one of his most trusted warriors to serve as a messenger who could carry communications between Sarah's cabin and the Apache camps. This would allow for coordination of the medical collaboration they had discussed and provide Sarah with protection if she encountered difficulties from white settlers who might not approve of her friendship with native peoples. The painted horse that remained as her immediate gift stood quietly in her pasture, its magnificent coloring seeming to glow in the slanted light of the winter afternoon. But more valuable than the horse, the crafted goods, or even the maps and safe passage guarantees were the relationships that had been forged during 7 days of crisis and cooperation. Running Wolf approached Sarah for what they both knew would be their final private conversation before he returned to his people. The boy who had nearly died from exposure a week earlier now stood before her as a young man whose confidence and maturity had been strengthened by surviving an ordeal that would have defeated many adults. "I will not forget what you taught me," he said quietly. "Not just the healing, but the way you treated me as a person worthy of respect rather than as an enemy to be feared." "And I will not forget what you taught me," Sarah replied. "About survival, about different ways of understanding the world, and about the possibility of friendship between people who are supposed to be enemies." Their exchange represented something larger than personal gratitude. In a territory where relationships between native peoples and white settlers were increasingly characterized by mistrust and violence, they had demonstrated that cooperation and mutual respect were possible when people chose to see past cultural differences toward common humanity. As Chief Ironhawk prepared to depart with his son and warriors, Sarah understood that her life had been fundamentally altered by the events of the past week. The isolation that had characterized her existence since Thomas's death had been replaced by connections that extended far beyond her immediate community. She had become part of a network of relationships that could influence the future of cultural interactions throughout the Montana Territory, the mountain meadow where the Apache bands had chosen to hold their summer gathering stretched across a high valley like a carpet of wildflowers and native grasses surrounded by peaks that still carried snow despite the July heat. Sarah had never seen so many native people gathered in one place, hundreds of lodges arranged in careful patterns that spoke of ancient traditions and complex social organization that extended far beyond her previous understanding of Apache culture. The journey to reach this sacred gathering place had taken Sarah 3 weeks, following the hidden routes that Chief Ironhawk's maps had revealed. She traveled with a small escort of Apache guides who had been waiting at designated meeting points, ensuring her safe passage through territory that would have been deadly for a white woman traveling alone. The painted horse that Chief Ironhawk had given her during the winter had proven to be an extraordinary companion for the mountain journey. The mare, whom Sarah had named Starfire for the distinctive white markings that decorated her dark coat, possessed an intelligence and sure-footedness that had made the treacherous trail through high passes seem almost effortless. But it wasn't just the physical journey that had challenged Sarah during the month since Running Wolf's departure. Her decision to accept Chief Ironhawk's invitation had created complications in her relationship with the white community that she served. Some of her neighbors viewed her friendship with Apache people as evidence of dangerous sympathies that could compromise the safety of other settlers. Mrs. Mitchell, her closest neighbor, James Crawford, had warned her just before her departure. "You're playing with fire by getting involved with those people. What happens when their warriors use information you've given them to plan attacks on white families?" The accusation stung because it revealed how little understanding existed between the communities that shared the Montana Territory. Sarah's medical collaboration with Apache healers was being interpreted as potential military intelligence sharing, and her acceptance of Apache protection was seen as disloyalty to her own people. But such concerns seemed insignificant as Sarah rode into the summer gathering and witnessed the reality of Apache culture rather than the distorted versions that circulated in white settlements. What she found was a sophisticated society celebrating the peak of their seasonal cycle, with ceremonies, trade negotiations, and social events that rivaled anything she had experienced in more conventional communities. Running Wolf was among the first to greet her arrival, but the boy she had nursed through hypothermia had been transformed by 6 months of growth and training. He now stood nearly as tall as his father, with the confident bearing of a young warrior who had proven himself in the challenges that marked the transition to adulthood. "Sarah," he called out in English, then switched to Apache as he spoke rapidly, to the crowd of people who had gathered to see the white woman who had saved his life. The story of their winter encounter had obviously grown in the telling, and Sarah found herself the object of curious but respectful attention from Apache, people of all ages. "You came," Running Wolf said with obvious pleasure. "My father wasn't certain that you would actually make the journey." "I gave my word," Sarah replied simply. "Besides, I've been looking forward to learning from Singing Bird and meeting the other medicine people she told me about." The reference to medical collaboration immediately attracted the attention of several elderly Apache women who had been observing Sarah's arrival with careful interest. Among them was Singing Bird, who approached with the dignity that Sarah remembered from their winter meeting, but also with obvious excitement about the knowledge sharing they had planned. "White medicine woman," Singing Bird said in carefully. "Practiced English? You bring healing tools from your world." Sarah gestured toward the pack horses that carried her medical supplies, instruments, and several books that she had selected as potentially useful for demonstrating European medical techniques. "I brought everything I thought might be helpful for teaching and learning." What followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her years of frontier medical practice. Instead of working alone in her isolated cabin, she found herself at the center of a medical conference that brought together healing traditions from across the Apache territory. Medicine people from different bands shared techniques that had been developed in response to the specific challenges of their environments. High mountain healers contributed knowledge of altitude sickness and cold weather injuries. Desert specialists offered treatments for heat exhaustion and venomous snake bites. Plains warriors brought expertise in treating arrow wounds and broken bones that resulted from buffalo hunting accidents. Sarah's contributions were received with the same respectful attention that the Apache healers showed to each other's knowledge. Her surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and anatomical understanding were evaluated not as superior or inferior to traditional methods, but as additional tools that could be integrated into the comprehensive healing systems that Apache culture had developed over centuries. "Your way of cleaning wounds prevents the sickness that kills many warriors," observed an elderly medicine man whose scarred hands testified to decades of treating combat injuries. But our way of using willow bark and other plants achieves the same healing with materials that can be found anywhere. The mutual exchange of knowledge created something unprecedented in Sarah's experience, a medical collaboration that transcended cultural boundaries while respecting the wisdom that each tradition had developed. She learned treatments for conditions that her medical training had never addressed, while contributing techniques that could save lives in situations where traditional medicine reached its limits. But the gathering offered more than medical education. Sarah found herself witnessing aspects of Apache culture that revealed the complexity and sophistication of a society that white settlers usually dismissed as primitive. The council meetings, where band leaders discussed territorial negotiations, trade relationships, and responses to government pressure, demonstrated political sophistication that rivaled any governmental body she had observed in white communities. Most remarkably, she was invited to participate in some of the ceremonies that marked the spiritual heart of the gathering, not as a convert or cultural appropriation, but as a guest whose presence honored the interconnectedness that Apache philosophy recognized between all living beings. "You saved the life of one of our children," explained an elderly chief whose band had traveled from the southern reaches of Apache territory. "That makes you part of the circle that connects all our people. Tonight, when we honor those who have shown courage and compassion, your name will be spoken alongside our own heroes." The ceremony that evening was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Hundreds of Apache people gathered around a central fire that seemed to reach toward the star-filled sky, while drummers created rhythms that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Stories were told in Apache and translated for Sarah's benefit, recounting acts of bravery, wisdom, and compassion that had shaped the history of the various bands. When Running Wolf stood to tell the story of their winter encounter, Sarah heard her own actions described in terms that transformed her simple medical care into something approaching legendary status. The blizzard that had brought them together was portrayed as a test sent by spirits to determine whether cooperation between different peoples was possible. Her decision to save his life became evidence that such cooperation could triumph over the forces that sought to divide the world into irreconcilable enemies. But the most significant moment came when Chief Ironhawk rose to make an announcement that would affect not just Sarah's future, but the relationship between Apache people and white settlers throughout the region. "This gathering has shown us that knowledge and wisdom can be shared between peoples who respect each other's traditions," he began, his words carrying the authority of someone whose opinions influenced the decisions of multiple bands. "The white medicine woman who saved my son's life has proven that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conflict." He paused, allowing his words to be absorbed by the assembled crowd, then continued with a proposal that made Sarah's heart race with excitement and apprehension. "I propose that we establish a permanent trading post and medical station where Sarah Mitchell can practice her healing arts while learning from our medicine people. This place would serve both our communities, providing a bridge between our worlds that honors the wisdom of both traditions." The proposal was met with discussion that continued late into the night, as representatives from different bands considered the implications of creating a permanent settlement dedicated to cross-cultural cooperation. Such a place would be unprecedented in the Montana Territory, requiring Apache people to trust white intentions while asking white settlers to accept native sovereignty over a shared facility. But Sarah's presence at the gathering and the obvious respect she had earned from Apache healers provided living proof that such cooperation was possible. Her medical skills had already been demonstrated through her treatment of injuries and illnesses that had occurred during the gathering, earning her a reputation that transcended the cultural boundaries that usually prevented such collaboration. As The discussions continued around smaller fires throughout the camp. Sarah found herself contemplating a future that would be radically different from anything she had previously imagined. The isolated cabin, where she had nursed Running Wolf back to health, could become the foundation for something much larger. A center for medical and cultural exchange that could influence the future of relationships between different peoples throughout the region. The painted horse that grazed peacefully in the meadow beside hundreds of Apache ponies seemed to symbolize the possibilities that were emerging from her unlikely friendship with Running Wolf and his people. What had begun as a simple act of medical charity during a winter blizzard was evolving into something that could change the future of an entire territory. The trading post and medical station that rose beside Willow Creek bore no resemblance to Sarah's original isolated cabin. What had begun as Chief Ironhawk's visionary proposal during the summer gathering had evolved into a thriving center of cross-cultural cooperation that served communities throughout the Montana Territory. The complex now included multiple buildings: Sarah's expanded medical clinic with its modern surgical facilities, comfortable quarters for visiting Apache healers, extensive storage facilities for trade goods, and meeting halls where representatives from different cultures could negotiate agreements that benefited everyone involved. But it was the garden that truly symbolized what they had accomplished together. Native medicinal plants grew alongside European herbs that Sarah had cultivated, creating a living pharmacy that combined the botanical knowledge of both traditions. Apache women worked beside white settlers' wives, sharing techniques for processing healing plants while learning new methods of preservation and preparation that extended the effectiveness of traditional remedies. Children from both communities played together between the carefully tended rows, learning from an early age that cooperation was natural rather than exceptional. Sarah stood in this garden on a crisp October morning, watching Running Wolf demonstrate surgical techniques to a group of young Apache men who were training to serve their bands as both warriors and healers. At 18, he had become something unprecedented in either culture, a bridge figure who could move seamlessly between Apache and white communities while serving the medical needs of both. His transformation from the dying boy she had found beside the creek was nothing short of miraculous. The key to removing arrow points, Running Wolf explained in English for the benefit of the mixed group of students, is understanding how the metal expands when heated and contracts when cooled. Sarah taught me this principle, but it uses the same knowledge that our people have always applied when shaping tools and weapons. His teaching method perfectly embodied the philosophy that had made their medical cooperation successful. Instead of replacing traditional knowledge with European techniques, they had found ways to integrate both systems, creating treatment capabilities that exceeded what either tradition could accomplish alone. The students around him included young, white men from farming families alongside Apache trainees, all learning from each other with an enthusiasm that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. The sound of approaching horses drew Sarah's attention to the main trail, where a familiar group was arriving for what had become a monthly consultation visit. Dr. William Harrison, the territorial physician who served the growing settlement of Stevensville, rode alongside Two Eagles, the senior medicine man from Chief Ironhawk's band. The unlikely pair had initially been suspicious of each other's methods, but 2 years of collaboration had transformed them into colleagues who genuinely respected each other's expertise and had co-authored several medical papers that were creating interest as far away as San Francisco and Denver. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Harrison called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the enthusiasm that always marked his visits to the medical station. I've brought those medical journals you requested from back east, including one that features our article about combining traditional and European surgical techniques. And Two Eagles has prepared the winter medicines we discussed for treating the lung ailments that always increase when the cold weather arrives. The exchange of resources and knowledge had become routine, but Sarah never lost her amazement at how naturally the cooperation had developed once the initial barriers of mistrust and misunderstanding had been overcome. White doctors now regularly consulted with Apache healers about treatments for conditions that were specific to frontier life, while native medicine people incorporated surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations that could address injuries and illnesses beyond the scope of traditional methods. The medical station's success had attracted attention from across the Western Territories. Sarah regularly received correspondence from doctors, government officials, and even newspaper reporters who wanted to understand how such unprecedented cooperation had been achieved. Several medical schools had requested detailed reports of their integrated treatment methods, and there was talk of establishing similar facilities in other regions where cultural conflicts hindered effective healthcare delivery. But the success of their medical collaboration had created opportunities that extended far beyond healthcare. The trading post had become a neutral ground where Apache bands could negotiate with territorial authorities. White settlers could establish relationships with native communities, and mixed-blood families could find acceptance in both worlds. Sarah's role had evolved from frontier doctor to something approaching a diplomatic mediator, helping to resolve disputes that might otherwise have escalated into violence. Her reputation for fairness and her connections within both communities gave her influence that extended throughout the region. Territorial Governor Benjamin Potts had appointed her as an unofficial cultural liaison, recognizing that her unique position made her invaluable for maintaining peace in an area that could easily have exploded into the kind of warfare that was devastating other parts of the West. "We have a situation that requires your counsel," Chief Ironhawk announced, as he arrived with a delegation that included representatives from 3 different Apache bands and 2 white settlements. His bearing remained as impressive as ever, but Sarah could see the lines that leadership responsibilities had etched around his eyes. The past 2 years had brought increasing pressure from federal authorities who wanted all Apache people relocated to designated reservations, regardless of their peaceful intentions or cooperative relationships with local communities. The territorial government wants to establish a new mining claim in the Sapphire Mountains, Chief Ironhawk continued, but the area they've chosen includes sacred sites that our people have used for ceremonies for generations. The mining company is backed by investors from back east who don't understand the significance of these places to our spiritual traditions. Such conflicts had become Sarah's specialty during the 2 years since the medical station's establishment. Her unique position as someone trusted by both communities allowed her to facilitate negotiations that sought solutions benefiting everyone involved rather than victory for one side over the other. She had successfully mediated disputes over water rights, grazing territories, and trade agreements, establishing a reputation that made her counsel sought throughout the Montana Territory. Let's examine the specific locations and see if there are alternative sites that could serve the mining company's needs without disturbing the ceremonial areas, Sarah suggested, her approach reflecting the problem-solving philosophy that had made her such an effective mediator. I've learned that most conflicts have solutions if we're willing to be creative and consider everyone's legitimate interests. The afternoon was spent in detailed discussions that revealed the complexity of issues facing the Montana Territory as different communities competed for access to the same resources. Maps were spread across the large table in the meeting hall, with Apache elders pointing out sacred sites, while mining representatives explained the geological surveys that had identified valuable mineral deposits. Sarah found herself translating, not just languages, but entire world views, helping each side understand perspectives that seemed foreign to their own cultural assumptions. The negotiations required all of Sarah's diplomatic skills, developed through 2 years of similar challenges. The mining company representatives initially seemed inflexible, viewing Apache spiritual concerns as obstacles to legitimate business development. The Apache elders, for their part, struggled to understand how white culture could place economic considerations above respect for ancestral traditions, but gradually, through patient explanation and creative problem-solving, a solution emerged that protected the sacred sites while providing the mining company with access to mineral deposits in adjacent areas. The agreement included provisions for Apache workers to be employed in the mining operation, creating economic opportunities that could help tribal communities adapt to changing territorial conditions. More importantly, the negotiation process established precedents for future conflicts, creating a framework for peaceful resolution that could be applied throughout the territory. The success of this mediation would be reported in territorial newspapers and government dispatches, adding to Sarah's growing reputation as someone who could build bridges between seemingly irreconcilable positions. As evening approached and the various delegations prepared to return to their communities, Sarah found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The desperate widow who had saved a dying Apache boy during a winter blizzard had become a respected leader whose influence extended far beyond the medical practice that had originally defined her role. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had decided not to investigate the sounds you heard that morning?" he asked, his question encompassing not just their personal relationship, but the broader changes that had resulted from her decision to help him. "I try never to think about paths not taken," Sarah replied, watching the water flow over the same rocks where she had first seen his unconscious form. "But I'm grateful every day that my conscience wouldn't let me ignore someone who needed help, regardless of who they were or where they came from." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider whose urgency immediately attracted their attention. The young Apache scout dismounted quickly and spoke rapidly to Running Wolf in their own language, clearly delivering news of significant importance. Sarah had learned enough Apache during the past 2 years to understand that the message concerned people in danger from severe weather. "What is it?" Sarah asked, reading the concern in Running Wolf's expression. "A wagon train is stranded about 20 miles north of here," Running Wolf explained. "Winter weather came early this year, and they're trapped by snow in a pass that becomes deadly when storms move through. There are families with children, and some people are already showing signs of serious cold sickness." The situation was exactly the kind of emergency that their medical cooperation had been designed to address, but it would also serve as a test of how well their cross-cultural partnerships could function under crisis conditions. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized that the rescue mission would require all the skills and relationships that had been developed during 3 years of careful cooperation. Within an hour, Sarah had organized a rescue party that included both Apache guides who knew the treacherous terrain and white settlers who could provide additional supplies and equipment for the relief effort. The response demonstrated how thoroughly the artificial barriers between communities had been broken down. Apache warriors worked alongside white ranchers to load medical supplies and cold weather gear, while their wives prepared food and blankets that could sustain the rescue party during what might be several days of dangerous travel. Dr. Harrison immediately volunteered to join the mission, as did 2 Eagles and several other Apache medicine people. The sight of white and native medical practitioners working together to prepare for an emergency rescue would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, but had become natural within the cooperative community that had grown around the medical station. The rescue mission that followed tested every skill and relationship that had been developed during 3 years of cross-cultural cooperation. Apache knowledge of winter survival proved crucial for reaching the stranded wagon train safely, while Sarah's medical expertise saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to hypothermia and other cold weather ailments. The journey through early winter conditions challenged even the experienced Apache guides, but their traditional knowledge of reading weather patterns and finding shelter in hostile terrain made the difference between success and tragedy. Sarah found herself remembering her own desperate situation 3 years earlier, when she had been the one facing death from exposure, and marveling at how completely her circumstances had changed. When they reached the stranded wagon train, they found 43 people in various stages of cold sickness, including several children whose conditions were critical. Sarah immediately established a field hospital in the most sheltered wagon, while Running Wolf organized the Apache guides to construct emergency shelters that could protect the most vulnerable travelers from the continuing storm. The medical crisis that followed required every technique that had been developed through their collaborative approach to frontier healthcare. Apache knowledge of treating exposure injuries, combined with European surgical and pharmaceutical methods to address conditions that neither tradition could have handled alone. Sarah found herself working side by side with 2 eagles to perform emergency surgery on a man whose frostbitten leg required immediate amputation to prevent fatal infection. But it was the sight of Apache warriors and white settlers working together to save families from both communities that truly demonstrated how far they had come from the mutual suspicion and hostility that had characterized relationships between their peoples just a few years earlier. Children who had been near death from hypothermia were warmed by fires built using Apache techniques, while Apache elders were treated with European medications that addressed ailments their traditional remedies couldn't cure. The rescue operation continued for 3 days, during which the mixed medical team saved all but 2 of the stranded travelers. The deaths that occurred were from injuries sustained before the rescue party arrived, and even those might have been prevented if help had reached them sooner. The success of the mission created another story that would be retold throughout the Montana Territory, adding to the growing legend of the medical station beside Willow Creek, where different cultures had learned to cooperate for the benefit of everyone who shared the challenging frontier environment. As Sarah returned to her expanded homestead after the successful rescue mission, she was accompanied by several families who had decided to settle in the area rather than continue their westward journey. The community that had grown around the medical station was becoming a permanent settlement where cultural differences were seen as sources of strength rather than reasons for conflict. The town that was beginning to take shape around her original cabin would eventually be called Harmony Creek, a name that reflected the cooperative spirit that had made its existence possible. Standing in her garden where Apache and European healing plants grew side by side, Sarah reflected on the power of individual choices to create changes that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Her decision to save Running Wolf's life during a winter blizzard had grown into something that was transforming relationships between peoples throughout the region. But the most remarkable testament to the success of their partnership was still to come. As autumn turned toward winter, a special delegation arrived at the medical station that would complete the promise made during that first incredible meeting with Chief Ironhawk 3 years earlier. The delegation consisted of Apache horsemen, leading a herd that took Sarah's breath away. 80 painted horses, each one more magnificent than the last, moved through her pasture like living artwork. The animals represented the fulfillment of Chief Ironhawk's original promise, one horse. For each day his people had searched for Running Wolf without knowing whether he lived or died. But these weren't just any horses. Chief Ironhawk had spent 2 years selecting animals that represented the finest examples of Apache horse breeding, creatures whose bloodlines stretched back generations and whose training had been perfected by the most skilled horsemen in the territory. Each horse was a masterpiece of natural beauty and practical capability, animals that could serve as both transportation and symbols of the cultural cooperation that had made their gift possible. These horses represent more than gratitude, Chief Ironhawk explained as he formally presented the herd to Sarah. They represent our commitment to the partnership that has grown from your act of compassion. As long as these horses run in your pastures, they will remind everyone who sees them that cooperation between our peoples is not only possible but profitable for all involved. The painted horse that Chief Ironhawk had given her as a symbol of gratitude during their first meeting now grazed peacefully among the magnificent herd, no longer alone, but part of a community that reflected the broader changes that had occurred. In their human relationships, the sight of 80 painted horses moving across the Montana landscape would become one of the most recognized symbols of successful cross-cultural cooperation in the American West. As winter stars appeared in the clear Montana sky, Sarah understood that her story had become part of something much larger than individual heroism or cultural cooperation. She had become living proof that the bridges between different worlds could be built by anyone willing to choose compassion over fear, understanding over prejudice, and hope over the hatred that seemed to divide too much of the world. The blizzard that had brought Running Wolf to her door had been one of the most severe storms in recent memory, but it had also created the conditions for one of the most remarkable partnerships in frontier history. What began with an act of medical charity had grown into a legacy that would influence the Montana Territory for generations to come, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the simplest human kindness. Years later, when historians wrote about the peaceful development of the Montana Territory and the unprecedented cooperation that had been achieved between different cultural communities, they would trace the origins of these remarkable changes to a winter morning when a widow named Sarah Mitchell heard cries for help beside her creek and chose compassion over caution. The 80 painted horses that continued to graze in the pastures around Harmony Creek served as living monuments to the truth that individual acts of courage and kindness could indeed change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.